I'm Ray Gauss, Digital Asset Management Architect at Alfresco, and in that role I do product management and engineering around digital asset management features in the product. But today we're going to be talking about adding views to Share's document library, and we'll touch on some of the digital asset management related interfaces there. So you've all by now seen the gallery view that's now available on 4.2 community and in the cloud. But let's take another quick look at that. Here's the standard detail view that we all know and love. We've got the simple view as well. And as we know in the detail view, we've got the concept of additional metadata like description, the tags. We have these social actions like favorites, likes, and then additional actions that may have been configured by the repository administrator for doing all sorts of things to various items of content. And in the gallery view, of course, we've got this grid layout of thumbnails to really highlight the content. It's a great way to visually search for an asset. And we have access through these info pop-ups to that same set of metadata, those same social actions or the additional actions that may have been configured by a repository administrator. And one thing to note here is that we've also got the ability on any of these views to make selections and perform actions against that selection. And that actually persists across each of the different views here. If we go to detailed view, we can see those same items selected. If we go to simple, we see them there. So that whole sharing of state, of views, of those metadata template renderings is all done through these document list view renderers, which share a common YUI data table, which allows them to share the state of that data, things like the pagination, the content set that's being viewed, and the sort ordering. And then they've also got methods for displaying that data, being able to render the different cell types within the content and the view. So we're going to take a look at the concepts of view renders and some of the specific methods involved there. We'll walk through a simple customization example, and then we'll talk about some more advanced techniques and what we can do with these view renders. If I say something that doesn't make sense, feel free to stop me and ask a question. But if it's a more general question, if you can, hold it till the end, and I may end up covering that. So in the past, if we wanted to add a view to Share's document library, it wouldn't have been the easiest task in the world. Those view methods were very much embedded in this document list JavaScript object. And within each of those view methods, there was only a simple versus detailed Boolean preference about how to display that specific piece of data. If the user has selected simple view, display it this way. If they've selected detail, render this other HTML. So adding one of those views would have been possible, but that requires a lot of customization and likely a lot of cutting and pasting, copying and pasting of code, and that wouldn't be easily maintained between Alfresco releases. Each time you'd probably have to revisit your code or lose functionality that may have been introduced in the code that you previously copied and pasted. And just curious, did anybody here in the past try to add a whole other view to Share? I'll buy you a beer later. I'll buy you a beer later. It was not fun, I would imagine. No. So that was how we had to add views in the past. Now we have this concept of the document list view renderers, and things are a lot different. This guy knows what I'm talking about. So just a refresher, we're talking about Share's surf components here. And within those, we've got server-side resources. Those include things like JavaScript that manipulate the data model, FreeMarker, which renders HTML fragments and passes them back to the client. Then we have client-side resources like JavaScript that is invoked by the browser, sent to the browser, invoked by the browser, and CSS files, of course, for formatting of the HTML. There's a lot of components. The one that we're targeting here is the document list component. And that document list uses a YUI data table, and YUI data tables use a data source. In our case, that's going to be information sent from the repository tier. And they also contain column definitions. Data tables contain column definitions that, among other things, indicate the data source field that we're talking about for a particular column, and a formatter method that's going to dictate how we want to display that data. An example of that is the render cell thumbnail method, but there are several of them. So here are the column definitions for the document list. We can see here we've got status thumbnail, file name, and within that thumbnail you can see that we've got the formatter method that we were talking about referenced here. And in this case, this render cell thumbnail method, this equals the document list object in question. So document list view renders are essentially a way of encapsulating all of that rendering logic, all of the UI logic, into its own JavaScript object. And the document list itself still contains those formatter methods, still contains a render cell thumbnail method, but what that actually does is calls upon the current view render selected by the user and the corresponding render cell thumbnail method in that view renderer. So one of the reasons it's done like that is these render cell whatever, thumbnail, description, name, methods in the document list object have been around for a while, and you all may have made extensions to the document list object, class extensions, and overridden a method like that. So this style allows that backwards compatibility, and any extensions of that class that you all may have done should remain in place, and that render cell thumbnail method wouldn't be affected if you're overriding it. So again, the document list still contains those. It's going to look up what is the current view selected by the user, and it's going to call the corresponding formatter within that view renderer object. So let's take a look at some of the key methods in these view renderers. Setup render is essentially called when this page loads, and you can use that to set up tooltips, set up pop-ups, set up mouse overs, user interface controls like the thumbnail size slider that we see in the gallery view, and you can use it to set up other animations and effects that you might want in your views. The render view is called when the user actually selects that particular view, or on refresh as the page loads, the default view that's been selected. It's actually persisted as a user preference, the view that they've selected. So render view is called then, and obviously that's used for HTML element rendering. We can use it for table changes, other DOM changes, and we can use it to set up event listeners to perform other actions when certain things happen. Destroy view is sort of a cleanup method, and it's called when the user selects another view. But in fact, it's actually called on all of the view renderers just before render view is. So it cleans up everything, starts with a clean slate, and then calls render view. And you use this destroy view method for, again, cleanup. You may need to hide the view that the user was on. You may need to clean up modifications to the DOM or tables, or you may want to hide controls, like again our thumbnail size slider, which of course is not going to be relevant in the other views. We talked about these formatter methods, so render cell thumbnail, render cell description, status, and obviously again those are called by the YUI data table formatter defined in the column definitions. So we're rendering the display of that column. We can also use that to set up drag and drops. For example, a folder in the document library That can be a target of a drag and drop, so we set that up there. And we might render actions, again, those actions configurable at least by the repository administrator. There are several other methods in there as well, like highlighting rows, file renames, and again, all dealing with display of the data and encapsulating all of that rendering logic into its own JavaScript object. So how do we go about actually adding one of these view renderers to the document library? First step is that we have to define that view. We essentially have to dictate what this JavaScript object is and what are those methods, how is it going to handle these renderings. We need to register that view with the document list object. We need to essentially tell it where that object lives and instantiate it for it. And then we need to enable that view as a selection for the user. So we're going to take a look again at a simple customization. And in this case, what we're going to do is just increase the size of the thumbnail in the standard detailed view available. So step one, we need to define this view. And again, that involves creating this new JavaScript object. So there we could just create a new instance of the base view render and give it a new name. Because the CSS class that is added, you guys can't see that. There we go. The CSS class added here, documents-large, is based on this name that we define in this constructor. And the metadata templates that are configurable, again, by repository administrator, are also pulled based on that large name. And this is, in fact, how the simple versus detailed view works now. The base implementation of the document list view render is the detailed view, and the simple view is simply another instance of that with a different name of simple. And in that case, we override the setup renderer method and the render cell thumbnail method. That's essentially for setting up tooltips, and the render cell thumbnail method is for setting up the little preview when you hover over the generic icon. So that was one method. We could also extend that base view renderer class with our own and do a lot more with it. So here's what that looks like. We can see at the bottom here, we're calling YUI's extend. We're extending document list large view render. It is an extension of document list view render. And we can see the constructor at the top here. We're still passing that name. And we're calling the superclass constructor because we want to be able to utilize anything that's set up there. And in this case, since we want everything else to look exactly like the detailed view, rather than going in and adding duplicate configurations of these metadata template renders, we're just going to override that and swipe the detailed name for each of those renderers. So it's just going to pull those same templates that have been configured for detailed view. So we're going to extend that base class. We still want to override this render cell thumbnail method. That's the point of our customization. We need more thumbnail. So this isn't the entire render cell thumbnail method, but the main piece that's changed here is that when we make this call to generate thumbnail URL, we're going to be requesting the image preview thumbnail definition rather than the default of doclib thumbnail definition. So just a note there on specifics, if anybody's curious, the doclib has a max width or height of 100 pics, and the image preview, depending on the version of Alfresco that you're dealing with, will either be 480 or more recently 960 max height or width. That would be a bit big for us here, so we need to add that custom CSS. Again, the CSS classes that are added to the HTML that's rendered is based on the name we've given this view renderer. And we can see here that documents-large that was in our rendered span we saw a few slides ago. We're going to provide that CSS here and limit that width because we don't need a full 960 in there. So we've defined our view. We've talked about how it's going to do all of this rendering. We need to register that view, step 2. And this is, again, another client-side operation. This is a JavaScript call that's handled by the browser. But we'll see in a little bit that it's actually a little more convenient to put that in a server-side FreeMarker reference. But it is something that's done by the browser. And what we want to do there is call document_list.register_view_render. And that, again, is going to tell the document list object about how to find our new view render. And the timing of that call is important. We need the document list object set up. We need the data source and data table set up. A few other things there. So we want to be sure to call that at the right time. And the right time to do that, it's just after post setup view renderers is fired by the document list. That's essentially the document list saying, hey, I'm ready to accept new views, throw them at me. And we can see that here. We have set up a listener for post setup view renderers. And we're calling a function here. We're pulling out a variable called scope that is the document list object. We're defining a new document list large view render with the name large. And then we're calling that register view renderer method. So we defined it, we registered it. We need to enable this view for the user. And that involves essentially adding the icon for them to be able to select this view. And that is going to happen on the web script data model. So we're going to add that to the view renderer names that are available to that web script. And the order is important. The order is also defined here of those different view renderers. So by default, we've got simple, detailed, gallery view. In this case, we're just going to add large onto the end of that list. But you could also dictate the order here as well. So let's take a look at that view. So we've got our simple, we've got our detailed, gallery, and now we have this large thumbnail view, which you can see is not a 100-pixel image expanded. We've used the new image preview thumbnail definition. So that's fine and great, but let's take a closer look at exactly what's going on there. We'll set some breakpoints in this JavaScript so we can determine when these methods are getting called that we talked about. Let's actually enable the breakpoints. That helps. So ignore that one. I don't know what that's coming from. So we've got setup render called. Again, that's going to be called on all of our view renders set up that have been registered. And notice that we are here inside. You all probably can't see that, can you? Everybody see that okay? No? What you may or may not be able to see is that we are in the document list view renderer class here, the base implementation. And we've just seen a couple of the setup render calls go by. Now again, destroy view is called on all of our views just before render view is. So we'll see that go by. And then our render view is called for the view that's been selected by the user. So in this case, we're just loading from the user's persistent preference, but if the user had clicked on it, we'd see the same behavior. So now we're into that mapping of our document list formatter methods to our current view and the corresponding formatter method. And you can see here, this is in the document list object. And we're just calling scope view renderers, the current view renderer name that's been selected, and then call the render cell thumbnail method of that current view. So then we'll step in. We've got a breakpoint here. Now we are in this large document list large view renderer, so our extended class. And we're calling the render cell thumbnail method there. So it's going to step through each of those for each thumbnail in the content set that we're looking at. We don't need to go through all of those. So that's what our simple customization looked like. But there's a lot more that we can do with this sort of thing. We can actually manipulate that underlying YUI data table. We can add columns to it in our render view method, which gives us a lot of flexibility, a lot of power. We do that by calling the data table insert column, and we just feed that a new column definition in that render view method. Now in destroy view, again our cleanup method, we probably want to reset those columns since our other views likely will not know what to do with these additional columns or how to render them. So we'll just reset it to what it originally was. And that's what we're doing with the spreadsheet view that you all saw briefly this morning. Let's take another look at that. I don't think we need that anymore. So we've got now this additional spreadsheet view. And as we see, we've added some columns here. And again, this has happened in our render view method. And in this case, these columns are actually dynamically built up dependent on the content that's in the current content set that we're viewing. So in this case, we've got some images in there that have the EXIF aspect applied. So we're going to add that as a possibility of our column definitions. And if we come across a document or other images that don't have that EXIF aspect, they'll just have null values in those columns. And this can happen for any aspect type, and the repository administrator can set up all sorts of customizations about what columns they want rendered for what, and apply different evaluators to them as well. So in this case, we're applying an aspect evaluator, asking if it has EXIF, make that available. We could do really any kind of evaluator you could imagine, a permissions-based evaluator. It's quite powerful, and that's just a generic feature of the metadata template rendering configurations. So we see that we have, since we are using those same metadata template renderings, we have access, as we saw this morning, the ability to change the names here. And there's the ability for the user to customize their experience as well. So in this case, we've just got the one that's got the description in there. We can hide that and get access to a lot more screen real estate to be able to determine which asset we're looking for or possibly modify the metadata. We do have the ability to reorder this stuff, and the user can even further customize their experience. And as mentioned this morning, we've got a lot more planned for this view in the future. And I can point out one more time that the selections here, again, since we're using the same data source, the selections are, of course, persisted across all of those different views. So that's the spreadsheet view. You can see that we can do a lot with manipulating those columns, but we can do even more beyond that. We actually don't need to render these as tables at all. And this isn't porn, I promise. My wife was worried, but that's just fantastic clip art. We can render this under whatever kind of HTML element we want. But YUI data table and YUI in general is very, very particular about things. It's adding a lot of IDs, it's adding a lot of classes, and we don't want to upset YUI. So we're going to let it do its thing and render all those IDs and classes. And then we're going to take the HTML that it's rendered, copy it over, or move it over, I should say, to our new HTML element structure, what we want to render. And then we'll just hide that parent HTML table element that YUI data table is filling in. Now, destroy view, we probably want to re-enable, re-show that table that we hid. Otherwise, the users will be looking at a blank screen. And render view is just going to repopulate that table, re-render that table anyway, so we don't have too many worries about this technique. So this one is really small. I apologize. Whoops. This guy here, right about here, is where we are actually doing that copy of inner HTML from the rendered cell, rendered by YUI data table, copying it into ours. And we need to empty that out once we're done, because we can't have duplicate HTML IDs present in both of these structures, or all sorts of fun stuff is going to happen. So that's how the gallery view is built. There are a lot of other things you can do with it. On our roadmap for media management module, we have this geo-tagged view, and Will Apson has actually already done a prototype of this available in Share Extras, where he's using these techniques. You can see that he is building the same additional info pop-up available there, but in this case, he is then feeding data points to Leaflet JavaScript library, which handles the mapping component. So there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do with these techniques. And we saw briefly this morning the focus view. Again, this is a view that's meant to really help the users connect with their content, immerse themselves in their content, and really step through a particular content set, determine what pieces, what assets within there are relevant to their current needs. So let's take a look at that again. If we refresh this, we've got yet another view up here, getting a little crowded up there. And as you saw, we can step through the main content area of the content set being viewed. In the bottom, we have navigation within that content set. Those two are connected such that if we go outside of the currently viewable navigation set there, it's going to automatically slide us to the next page of those. Obviously, we can click on these at the bottom for the actual content navigation and slide between essentially the pagination within that content navigation set at the bottom. If we want to see nothing but the content, we can hide that content navigation and the header at the top, and still, again, step through that content set. And we have access to that same or similar info panel here, where we've got those additional metadata renderers, the social actions, the other actions configured by the repo admin. And of course, the selections, you can see down perhaps not see down here, the selections will persist across all of these views because, again, sharing the same data table underneath. Before I go back there, just take a second to explain a little more detail about how this works. In this case, what we're doing is rendering a ordered list HTML element, only for the sake of utilizing existing carousel JavaScript libraries, which is what those libraries usually prefer as their HTML structure. So we're rendering two lists in this case. We've got one for that main content section, and we've got one for the content navigation at the bottom. And those actually use slightly different ordered lists. We couldn't feed it the same one. For instance, the content navigation at the bottom is actually using the doclib thumbnail definition, and the one at the top is using the image preview, much larger 960 by 960 definition, which on this tiny little resolution, and by the way, this looks a lot better on a larger resolution, you know, we could maybe get away with extending the 100 pixel, but we've also got this full screen mode coming. We can really blow this view up and focus on nothing but the content. And in that case, we certainly need something a lot larger. So 960 is generally sufficient there. So again, there we've got the two list elements, and we're feeding that to, in this case, YUI carousels is the JavaScript library used for the animation effects and everything else. Image preview in the main content area, doclib for the content navigation. So just a brief look at the inheritance structure of the views that we've seen here. Again, the simple view is just another instance of the base document list view renderer. It's got a different name of simple. It overrides setup render, and it overrides render self thumbnail. The gallery view is an extension of the base list view renderer class, and that focus view we saw is actually an extension of that gallery view. So you can continue to extend these and have inheritance trees all over the place that you can decorate for Christmas, I suppose. The geo view is currently an extension of directly of the base, but Will's looking at possibly making that extend gallery view as well. And the spreadsheet view, and maybe I should take a second to talk about why the focus view extends that gallery view, because they work very similarly in terms of how they are swiping that YUI rendered HTML and putting it over into the different structure. Whereas something like that spreadsheet view renderer isn't doing any of those kind of techniques. It's just adding columns. So spreadsheet view is just another extension of that base document list view renderer. Now, there's lots of ways that we can all get these customizations set up, structured. There's lots of ways that we can get that code then into our final repository, and in this case, share wars. But these sort of customizations lend themselves particularly well to being developed and packaged as these share extensibility modules or share extension modules that, as you saw me turning on and off in the module deployment page, are very easily added, removed. What we didn't show yet here was the ability to tie those to different evaluators. So you can have evaluators where only certain sites, you could just prefix a site with a certain name, and that would automatically perhaps get the focus view, or others prefixed with accounting maybe get the spreadsheet view, although both are pretty usable for both use cases there. But you have access to a whole suite of evaluators already out there, or you can develop your own evaluators to determine exactly when to display these different document library views. So the structure of those modules, and again, I won't go into too much detail here, but there's lots of information on the engineering blogs from Dave Draper, Eric Minloff, about these kind of customizations in these modules, and I encourage you to attend their talks as well. But here we're talking about defining the module in this section here. This is telling Share that it is a module that's available for that module deployer. Here we've got the server-side definition of those Share Surf components that we were talking about. And these are really just the overrides that we want to do, the customization of the base class. And within that module definition, we're defining a source-to-target mapping of what package it is that we're trying to customize. And that could be at several different levels. You may want to customize just a component. You may want to go higher up in the hierarchy there. And then at the bottom, we've got the server client-side resources, those that are sent to the browser. So there we've got the icons that are used for the user selection of the view, and we've got the CSS and the client-side JavaScript. So one thing to note is that the order of these modules can be important. We saw that we were just pushing onto the end of the view renderer names when we enable this view for the user, just tacking on large to the end. So the order that you load the modules within that module loader, you can define, you can move the position of each of your modules. So that may affect your display order. That's one thing to note. And then also the inheritance. So if we, for example, we saw that focus view extends gallery view. If we were to try to load focus view first, it doesn't know about the gallery view JavaScript class yet. So we want to have that loaded first. Gallery view first, then focus view. We can still change the order of display of those by not just pushing onto the end of the view render names. But in terms of when the different JavaScript files get loaded, the order can be important of your module deployment. And then in terms of packaging, how we get this code into our wars, there's a lot of ways to go about that, we all know. But we really encourage you to start looking at doing this as share amps. There's been a lot of work around the module management tool and supporting share amps there for deployment into wars. There's been a lot of work in the Alfresco Maven plugin side of things to have that behave very nicely and produce clean share amps that are then obviously able to be deployed by MMT. So really start considering moving to share amps if you're not already for delivering these kind of customizations. So again, we took a look at adding views with these view renders and the steps involved there, how to actually get it in there, define the view, register the view with the document list object, and then enable that view. We talked about some of those key methods like the setup renderer, the render view, destroy view for our cleanup, and the various formatter methods like render cell thumbnail, description, that are actually going to display that data for us. Walk through that simple customization of adding the larger thumbnail, and then we talked about those more advanced techniques like manipulating that data table, the column definitions involved there, and the non-table views where we can swipe out what was rendered by YUI and put it in our own HTML structure. So I encourage you all to go out and build your own view renders and tell us all about it. Anxious to hear it. And I've got a blog post on this at rgauss.com. It goes into some more detail about the packaging side of things, but this is probably more in depth about the overall structure of things. We will be consolidating these blogs soon, so some of that will move, and in the future, I'll probably be found, Alfresco related posts at least, will probably be found on blogs.alfresco.com. And the sample code for that simple customization is available on GitHub under the Alfresco Labs organization. And I don't need to repeat that whole URL there. And my Twitter handle is rgauss if you all want to contact me there or here at the conference. Any questions from anyone? Yes? One second, he's got a mic there.
Well, the data formatter, can that work on the folders? It's like folder may have certain aspects, attributes, and we actually have that kind of scenario, the package of documents, like record management or something else. So they do have attributes, and it would be nice it can work on the folders.
Yeah, the same techniques are applied to folders. So as we saw, the column definitions, the basic column definitions for the document list include things like the name, description, thumbnail, and then and actions, things like that. So just a few of those views. And then actually within that description cell is a more complex formatter that does picking up of those metadata template renderers defined. Things like the actual description. So the name of the cell is called description, but the actual description of the node, the additional tags, those social renderers. So you could certainly set up a situation where if you had custom data on just folders, let's say, you could override that render cell description method and put in calls there that would say if it has some aspect. But likely you wouldn't need to, because you could configure that through the standard metadata template renders. There are line and banner metadata template renders. You could probably just do it through one of those and not actually have to touch that render cell description method at all.
So that basically you don't have to do anything, it will work?
Well, you would have to set up the configuration for those metadata template renderers. And if you wanted it, say you wanted it displayed in its own column, you wanted to add another, then you would use these techniques certainly too. If you didn't want that lumped into that same description field and you wanted to add a separate column for just your custom metadata, then you would certainly need to do the techniques we saw in the spreadsheet view where you could add additional columns and then call upon those metadata template renderers that you had set up.
Well, also, another one is the recursive, like you got image gallery, but you do have folder within the image gallery which has more pictures in it, and what you're going to do, like can you drill down? Like can you in your gallery view drill down a folder?
Yeah, so the gallery view works just like the others, and in the case of the gallery view specifically, when you click on the name that we saw at the bottom that's overlaid on top of the thumbnails, be it for a folder or for a piece of content, when you click on that name, it's going to take you to it. So in the case of a content object, that's going to take you to document details. In the case of a folder, you're going to navigate to that folder. Similar to the detail or simple views that are already there.
But the image for that folder will be something like folder.
Yes, I see what you're saying. So that comes into play particularly for the focus view we saw, where we've got that large content filling the screen. Doesn't do us a whole lot of good to fill it with a gigantic folder icon, I guess is what you're asking. So certainly on the roadmap there, to be able to display some hint of what it is that's in that folder. Obviously, if there's 10,000 items in there, we can't display all of those, but give you some preview of what are the contents of that particular folder. So that's not there yet, but it's on the roadmap.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much.